Hello, and welcome to VerVictions episode 4. My name is Nathan, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about God's will. I've been wanting to understand this more because I've been asking God, what is your will for my life? What do you want me to do? And God's been showing me that I will never fully understand His will, and I need to be okay with that. He reminded me of Isaiah 55, 8 through 9, which says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." But God did reveal to me the most basic form of His will, which I was missing this as a point of focus, but was achieving in part through my actions. And it didn't hit me until I was up late one evening, about 2 a.m., just laying in bed, and I was just thinking about the Word, and God reminded me of the Bible study that my wife and I recently started together. So that brings us to Romans chapter 2 today, and then I'm going to bring us back to Matthew chapter 5, which is where we left off from the last episode. In Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 17, we have Paul addressing the church in Rome because they are heavily transgressing God's laws. They are making judgments on people who break God's laws, even though they break them themselves, and they're teaching others or approving of others who live in incorrect ways. So Romans 2, 17 through 18 says, "Indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know His will, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law." So in other words, Paul is saying that you know what God's will is because you are instructed in His laws. When I read this at that time, I came to a quick conclusion. God's laws equals God's will. So in the back of my head, I had already decided to comb through all 613 commandments that were given through Moses to figure out what God's will is for me. The math seemed simple at the time. But as I was staying up that night at 2 a.m., I was reminded of another scripture out of 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3. Now, Paul is specifically talking about the spiritual gifts and their use in the church, and this is for chapters 12 through 14 of 1 Corinthians, just to provide some context. But at the start of chapter 13, which is a chapter all about love, this is what the first few verses says. "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." So Paul is making it really clear that you can do incredible things, be blessed with incredible gifts, but if you don't do it with love, then you have accomplished nothing, and you profit nothing. So then how does this connect to God's will? Let's head back to Matthew 15, 1 through 9. At this point in Matthew, Jesus is having a discussion with the Pharisees who are claiming that the disciples of Jesus were transgressing the law because they did not wash their hands before they ate. Well, in short order, Jesus calls them hypocrites because the Pharisees transgressed the law with their man-made traditions. And he quotes the prophet Isaiah to them in verses 8 and 9, saying, "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." If you go back to VerVictions episode 2, I comment on how God does not want us to be like the Pharisees, because the Pharisees say and do a lot of things that appear to make them righteous, but they were hypocrites in that they were seeking praises of men, or they were transgressing the laws themselves by their traditions. But the element I want to focus on here is where it says, "Their hearts were far from me." God doesn't want lip service or vain worship. He wants your genuine love. So once again, we have to ask, how does this connect to God's will? Well, let's move ahead to Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. In this chapter, the Pharisees, in an attempt to trip up Jesus, question him, asking, "What is the great commandment in the law?" And this is Jesus' reply. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. The part of emphasis really is verse 40, where it says, on these two commandments hang all the law. So when I go back to Romans 2:18, which is describing that if you know God's law, you know God's will, and I came to the conclusion that, okay, well, if I look through all 613 of the laws that God gave to Moses, I can understand his will. In reality, I only need to look at 2. I don't need to look at the other 611 if I only understand these 2 right here. So what I can do now is update the equation I gave earlier. God's laws equals God's will. Well, we can replace God's laws with this. Love God plus love your neighbor equals God's will. So God's will is simple in nature, but obviously accomplishing those 2 things can be extremely difficult and complicated, but the equation holds true even if you weigh it against the first 10 commandments. For example, the first one being, I am the Lord thy God. You shall have no other gods but me. Simple. If I love God, I wouldn't place any other gods before him. We won't take the Lord's name in vain. Once again, simple. I'm not going to pointlessly use the authority of the Lord's name by using it in vain. Thou shalt keep the Sabbath day holy. Once again, we keep the Sabbath day holy out of respect to God. Well, if we respect God, that means we are loving God. Thou shalt honor your father and mother. Well, if we love thy neighbor is a metaphor in a way. It's saying love anyone who is also not yourself. So your father and your mother, they're not you. They are your neighbor. They're also your parents. Honor them, love them. Next one, don't kill. Next one, don't commit adultery, don't steal. These ones are simply stated because if you're murdering someone, if you're committing adultery, if you're stealing, you are taking from someone what was rightfully theirs, which you wouldn't want to be done to yourself. So therefore, you don't love that person if you're committing those things. Not to bear false witness, don't lust after your neighbor's wife, don't covet your neighbor's things. In every single instance, it's pretty easy to figure out if you love God and you love your neighbor, then you are performing God's will. If we take this back to Matthew chapter 5, where we left off from last episode, and look specifically at verses 21 through 26, where Jesus is talking about anger in your heart. And this is something that I'm working through myself, obviously, as I go through this. But this is what Jesus says in verses 23 through 24. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. When you understand God's will, it really magnifies the significance of this statement. In the practice of that age, bringing your gift to the altar was your moment of redemption and commitment to God. It is, in a way, a display of love. Jesus is saying that your gifts are pointless. You're simply honoring me with your hands. You're honoring me with your lips, like the Pharisees did in Matthew 15:8. Because if you truly loved me, you would reconcile with your brother because I asked you to. And I asked you to do this when I told you to love your neighbor, which he reemphasizes the first 2 great commandments. Love thy God, love your neighbor. If you are worshiping God with your lips, but you transgress his laws outside of church, you're worshiping in vain, just like the Pharisees. If you're tithing to church, giving your gift to God, but you're still angry with someone, or you have sinned against someone and they're angry with you, then God's telling you to leave your tithe in your pocket, because if you were to give right now, you're simply doing it to satisfy your own guilt. What Jesus is saying here is that if you truly loved me, you would honor me through how you love others, which comes back to 1 Samuel 15:22, which says this, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed the fat of rams. So God doesn't want your sacrifices. He doesn't want your empty worship. He doesn't want your empty offerings if your heart is not in it. Your heart isn't in it if you're not loving those around you. Because if you're not loving those around you, that's the one thing God has asked you to do after loving Him. All those actions you were taking to show God appreciation, love, and glory were done in vain when your heart is not set on obeying Him. And to do something in vain means you do not succeed in achieving what you intend. I myself regretfully lived my life in vain for a long time, but I'm very thankful for God for bringing me back to Him and turning my heart so that when I am giving Him glory, honor, and praise, I'm not doing it in vain. I can succeed in that. And of course, I still fall short in many different ways. Now, one thing God is showing me is that this is His broad will for the world. Everyone should act like this. It is what He wanted from the beginning. But in order to share His love for the world, He may still have you do some very specific things, whether that's talking to someone, or working at a specific location, calling someone you haven't called in a while. God is placing you in those positions to execute His will. So now I need to go back to the question I had for God at the beginning of this, asking Him, what is His will for my life? Well, now I've refined the question to say, God, how do you want to use me so that I can accomplish your will in my life, now that I have a better idea of where that even begins? So my concluding thoughts are, when was the last time you showed someone in your household how much you love them for no apparent reason? Maybe it's your daughter, your brother, your father, your mother, your son, your sister. For me, I would tell my wife that I love her and I cherish her, and I wouldn't trade any second that I've spent with her with any other time of my life. So I think today would be a really good day for you to reach out to someone today and tell them how much you love them. Reach out to someone today and reconcile, forgive, or maybe even ask for forgiveness. Bring yourself back to God, and He will absolutely make you whole. So I thank you for listening today, and I pray you stay around for more episodes in the future. Thanks.